Time to start because we are a little late, and so let me introduce next speaker is Marc Andree from the Freiburg University, and the title of his talk is First Person's Perspective à la Baker. They are not what they seem.
Thank you. The notion of first-person perspective seems as natural as one could hope for. After all, each of us has his or her own point of view from which he or she perceives the world. And to deny that such a point of view exists seems absurd. To doubt that it plays a vital role in many of our practical respects is barely reasonable. Phenomenologically, neither the existence nor the most essential characteristics of first-person perspectives are a matter of controversy. Baker's notion of first-person perspective is not quite so straightforward as our ordinary notion, though she seems to take both notions to be identical, and though she justifies the existence of first-person perspectives in her sense, I appeal to phenomenology and common sense. But I think what she calls a first-person perspective is more theory-laden. Or so I will argue. By phenomenology, I don't mean the sense of the talk of Professor Marc this morning. I mean the broadly analytical sense which refers to the qualitative character of our experience. The outline of my talk is as follows. First, I argue that a mere point of view need not have the features Baker takes first-person perspectives to have, even if this point of view is irreducible in the way Baker claims. Second, I explain the metaphysical problems that Baker's account of personal identity faces. Third, I explain its practical problems. And it is important to note here that the problems concerning personal identity that Baker's account faces, in my opinion, are not just minor irritations on an area of philosophy that is not of Professor Baker's primary interest. They are not just bullets one has to bite in order to come by with some plausible account of the mental at all. They rather point to what is seriously wrong with Baker's ontology. And in order to show that one could preserve much of Baker's view without presupposing her account of personal identity, I sketch in the last part of my talk an account of an irreducible first-person perspective that does not have the disadvantages I criticize. In her book, Baker defines a first-person perspective as the capacity to make self-attributions of first-person reference, such as, I am glad that I am a philosopher now, or I deeply regret that I once was a fortune teller. In both statements, the I, marked with an asterisk, is a self-attribution, since it is the utterer of the respective sentence who is a philosopher now or was a fortune teller once. And it is of first-person reference, since it refers to the same person as the I in the main clause. And as it is certainly true that normal human beings have the capacity to think and utter such statements as one or two, it seems out of doubt that human beings have first-person perspectives in Baker's sense. Note, however, the difference between 1 and 2. In order to be a self-attribution, 2, but not 1, presupposes that I persist through time. I can be glad that I am a philosopher now without having to admit that I was already there yesterday. But I cannot deeply regret that I once was a fortune teller without assuming that I already existed in the not too recent past. Baker does not distinguish between sentences such as 1, which can be true without me persisting through time, and sentences such as which cannot. But as we will see, her discussion of personal identity clearly shows that she assumes that a particular first-person perspective can be exemplified longer than a moment by the same entity. So her notion of a first-person perspective must be taken to presuppose that we persist through time. The fact that it is at least controversial from a phenomenological point of view. So Galen Strawson, for example, doubts our persisting through time for purely phenomenological reasons. Okay. He says that all we can perceive is a moment of consciousness that purports to have memories of other moments of consciousness. Is it better?
Yeah, it's good, but now we have to tell you.
Okay.
Because there is no...
Try, because I'm not sure whether you hear the same that I hear. Okay. So, further point. In addition, merely having a first-person perspective does not entail that someone who utters two thereby makes a literally true statement of personal identity. To have the capacity of making a certain kind of self-attribution does not include the truth of the self-attribution. Professor Baker, however, seems to presuppose that our capacity to utter and understand such sentences such as two guarantees the literal truth of two, and hence rules out the option that there are many different short-living exemplification of first-person perspectives that follow one another and together form what we commonly call a person. In doing this, she dismisses the theories of philosophers such as Hume, Russell, Perry, Parfit, Lewis or Noonan from the outset. Of course, Baker could and probably would claim that exemplifying a first-person perspective indeed presupposes persistence through time because it involves having literally true memories, taking literally real commitments and so on. Then, however, it is not obvious anymore that there are such things as first-person perspectives. Arguing for the existence of a first-person perspective with such characteristics, one cannot rely on phenomenology, since persistence through time is phenomenologically doubtful, and one cannot rely on common sense, because common sense is silent when it comes to highly theoretical ontological matters, such as whether we are enduring or perduring entities. So Baker's dilemma is that the more interesting the characteristics one takes first-person perspectives to have, the less clear it is whether we have first-person perspectives at all. And similar arguments can be put forward against the presumed indivisibility and the presumed unduplicatability of exemplifications of first-person perspectives. These characteristics too seem phenomenologically doubtful. Take a fission case, in which the brain of a person, say Angela Merkel, is split into two half-brains, each of which is planted into the head of another person, sufficiently similar to the original one. The resulting person who received the left half-brain is called lefty, the resulting person who received the right half-brain is called righty. And both lefty and righty, it is assumed, are in every relevant respect proper mental successors of Angela Merkel. They remember being her and share her thoughts, beliefs, desires, and character traits. If you would like to have some empirical evidence that this scenario is possible, there is a famous paper of Thomas Nagel who cites the case of epileptics whose brainstem is the part of the brain that connects the two hemispheres is cut through for theoretical reasons, and it was observed that each half brain, bit by bit, was able to learn to fulfill all the tasks it normally takes a whole brain for. So it surely is possible that lefty and righty are psychologically continuous to Angela Merkel. And as both remember being Angela Merkel, each of them has the impression to share Angela Merkel's first-person perspective. Hence, there is phenomenological evidence that first-person perspectives are divisible. Or take a scenario where Angela Merkel is scanned and the screening data is used to generate a perfect physical duplicate of her. It is then plausible to assume that this duplicate shares her mental life as well. In other words, the duplicate has the impression to share her first-person perspective. Hence, there is phenomenological evidence that perspectives are duplicable. Baker denies this. She says in her book, your first-person perspective is an exemplification of the property first-person perspective, a property whose instances cannot be divided or duplicated. So a molecule-for-molecule replica of your body would not have your first-person perspective. In order to sum up what I have said so far, there is no phenomenological reason to suppose that first-person perspectives are indivisible and unduplicable, or that their owners persist through time. Quite to the contrary. Moreover, all these characteristics do not follow from Baker's characterization of a first-person perspective as the capacity to conceive of oneself as oneself in the first person, because this capacity can be explicated in a way that does not pursue far-reaching ontological facts. As I pointed out, self-attributions could be understandable but taken literally false. And it is important to note here that there are no reasons to regard first-person perspectives as indivisible or unduplicable, or that their owners persist through time. That this claim is logically independent from the thesis of the irreducibility of the first-person perspectives that Baker puts forward. More to this in a few minutes. To assume that persons defined as entities that have a first-person perspective essentially persist through time and are indivisible and unduplicable plays an important role in Baker's account on personal identity, especially in her explication of what happens in a fission case. From the indivisibility of an original person's first-person perspective, it follows that it is impossible in a fission case that both lefty and righty share a first-person perspective. So she writes, which is the original person, lefty or righty? There are not just two possible answers, but three possible answers to the question, which is the original person. The answers are either lefty, righty, or neither. And the not-so-simple view, that is Baker's name for her account of personal identity, is compatible with all three answers. We may not know which is the correct answer, but the not-so-simple view implies that there is a fact of the matter that depends on whether lefty or righty or neither has the original person's first-person perspective. Now, like adherents of theories of immaterial substances, Baker claims here that there is a fact of the matter, whether lefty or righty or neither, is identical to the pre-fission person. And the reason is that there is, according to her, a fact of the matter, whether lefty, righty, or neither has the original person's first-person perspective, although there is no empirical evidence whatsoever concerning who shares the original person's perspective, since the scenario is perfectly symmetrical. So Baker has to admit, as in fact she does, that we may not know which person shares the original person's perspective, although phenomenologically the case seems to be quite clear, because both lefty and righty are under the impression to share the original person's perspective. Unlike theorists of immaterial substances, Baker can claim that there is a fact of the matter in fission cases without claiming the existence of philosophically suspect entities like souls or Cartesian egos. It would be too fast, however, to credit that to the emergent property of a first-person perspective, since the existence of irreducible first-person perspectives gives us no reason to suppose that persons persist through time and are indivisible and unduplicable. So their existence is not sufficient for Baker's account of personal identity, and neither is it necessary. because a simple view need not involve first-person perspectives in order to be not so simple, that is compatible to materialism. For example, many properties that supervene on physical properties or are emergent can do the work of first-person perspectives with regard to personal identity. For instance, a view according to which personal identity supervenes, for whatever reason, on the identity and intactness of a certain part of the brain would yield the same results. There is perhaps unknowable fact of the matter as to what happens in thought experiments such as fission cases, namely that the post-fission person that owns the critical part of the brain is identical to the original person, and we need not involve immaterial substances but only particular supervenience facts. In short, first-person perspectives, in a phenomenologically harmless sense, are neither necessary nor sufficient for the not-so-simple view of personal identity that Baker endorses. Things are even worse. Baker's account also has severe consequences that she does not discuss. In order to explain them, I will present two thought experiments, one given by Parfit, the other inspired by him. In Parfit's so-called combined spectrum, a series of cases is described in which one person is transformed by a molecule-per-molecule exchange into another, say Angela Merkel into Vladimir Putin. In the first case, only one molecule of Angela Merkel's body is replaced by the respective molecule of Vladimir Putin's body. In the second case, one further molecule of Merkel is replaced by a second molecule of Putin, and so on. In the last case of the spectrum, all of Merkel's molecules are replaced by Putin's. Near the one end of the spectrum, the resulting persons are clearly more similar to Merkel, because only very few of the molecules were exchanged, and thus can be said to still have her first-person perspective. Near the other end of the spectrum, the resulting persons are clearly more similar to Putin, since they have almost all of his molecules, and thus have his first-person perspective. But what can be said about the cases in the middle of the spectrum? As Merkel and Putin obviously do not share the same first-person perspective, and as there can be no persons without the first-person perspective at all, the persons in the middle either share Merkel's perspective or Putin's perspective, or have a new one, which is neither Merkel's nor Putin's. Now, whatever option one chooses, there have to be somewhere in the spectrum two adjacent cases that differ only by one molecule, hence are qualitatively more or less identical, but exemplify different first-person perspectives. For example, either Merkel's and Putin's, or either Merkel's and a new one. But this sounds absurd. Almost no qualitative difference, but a difference in having first-person perspective. In another series of cases, which I call the reunion spectrum, the fission case is followed by the fusion of the fission products. Imagine Angela Merkel's brain split into two half-brains that are kept separately for some time and are then unified again, whereby the unified brain has memories of lefty, of righty, and of Angela Merkel before the fission took place. In this reunion spectrum, the cases vary with respect to the time that passes between fission and fusion. At the one end of the reunion spectrum, several years lie in between. At the other end of the reunion spectrum, only a very short time, say a second, lies in between fission and fusion. There is a remark in an earlier book of Professor Baker, Persons and Bodies, that there is only one first-person perspective exemplified in those cases where only a very short time lies in between, or there are two streams of consciousness for a short time. This is what she says. Somewhere near the middle of the spectrum, however, there have to be two adjacent cases differing only in that the reunion takes place a second earlier in one of them and a second later in the other, such that in one case only one first-person perspective is exemplified, and in the other case two first-person perspectives are exemplified. And this again seems absurd. So each of the spectra reveals to us the implausibility or the assumption that personal identity depends on a property that is either definitely exemplified or definitely not exemplified. At least in the cases under consideration here where all the persons involved have robust first-person perspectives. In addition to these metaphysical complications, there are practical ones. One of the most prominent reasons why we are interested in personal identity at all is because we hope to find answers to questions like what matters in survival and what should we rate under which conditions is one responsible for particular actions committed earlier. It is hard to believe, however, that virtually imperceptible deviations can make all the difference when it comes to survival or moral responsibility. Take the fission case, if the original person committed a crime before the fission took place, who is morally responsible for that crime, lefty or righty? It's implausible that it is the one who shares the original person's perspective because, for a start, we are simply not able to determine if this is lefty or righty, and more importantly, sameness of memories, beliefs, and especially character traits seems far more important for moral responsibility than some non-empirical and perhaps non-knowable fact like sameness of first-person perspective. And if this is right, then being morally responsible does not consist in having the same first-person perspective. Similarly, what matters in survival? That there is some future person that shares my thoughts, feelings, memories, and so on, or that there is some future person that has the same first-person perspective that I have. To be clear, normally, psychological continuity and continuity of first-person perspective goes hand in hand. But in thought experiments in which they come apart, we can see what is more essential. And there we see that we do not care much about having the same first-person perspective, which we might not even know, but that we care most about that there is some future person who has our beliefs, desires, character traits, and so on, memories. Therefore, first-person perspectives in Baker's heavily presuppositional sense are inappropriate to capture what lies at the heart of the debate on personal identity, namely questions on rationality and morality. They track these questions quite good as long as we stick to everyday cases in which psychological continuity and first-person perspective go hand in hand, but they lose this quality when we consider thought experiments in which these two do not go hand in hand anymore. If it were clear that there are first-person perspectives in Baker's stance, then we would have to live with all these consequences. But we can say the most central feature of Baker's account, namely the claim that first-person perspectives are irreducible without presupposing an implausible view on personal identity. As I explained, exemplifications of first-person perspectives need not persist through time. They can be, for example, moments of consciousness. Now take an aggregate that is a mereological sum of moments of consciousness that are interrelated psychologically. so that there is a continuity of memories, desires, beliefs, and character traits, and so on, between earlier and later moments. Then there is no entity, or if we take the sum itself to be an entity, no non-trivial entity that unifies these moments of consciousness. Nevertheless, we could say that all these moments of consciousness share the same first-person perspective, by definition. A consequence of this view is that, in our fission case, two first-person perspectives are involved. One that is exemplified by the moments of consciousness that together make up the original person, plus the moments of consciousness that together make up lefty, and one that is exemplified by the moments of consciousness of the original person and those of righty. Thus, the first-person perspective of the original person is divided into two first-person perspectives. Similarly, first-person perspectives exemplified by moments of consciousness are duplicable. And to be sure, Baker would not accept this account, and neither would I like to endorse it. I just stated to show that there is a theoretical option which he doesn't discuss. I claim that these first-person perspectives, as I define them here, are still irreducible. Why are they irreducible? Compare what Baker writes about the uninformativeness of simple views of personal identity. It is impossible to have informative, necessary, and sufficient conditions for transtemporal personal identity. Persons are basic entities. Being a person does not consist in satisfying non-personal conditions. So any correct account on personal identity must be uninformative, otherwise it would be reductive. If we take exemplifications of first-person perspective to be moments of consciousness rather than persisting identities, we reduce persons to specific aggregates of moments of consciousness. We give a reductive account of personal identity. That is what Baker criticizes in the quotation, the reductiveness of accounts that deny that the owners of first-person perspective persist through time. She overlooks, however, that we have to distinguish two kinds of reductionism. Reductionism that reduces persons to, for example, moments of consciousness, and reductionism that reduces intentional states to neural states. And it is this last kind of reductionism against which Baker's arguments for the irreducibility of first-person perspectives are directed. The reductionism of the mental in terms of the physical. Logically independent from it is the first kind of reductionism, the reductionism of the persisting in terms of the momentary. To be sure, there are philosophers, for example, Sidney Shoemaker, who argue for a close tie between these two kinds of reductionism. But without engaging in further arguments, one cannot take it for granted that the irreducibility of the intentionality entails the irreducibility of persons as persisting entities. That is why it is possible to combine her irreducibility arguments with reductionism of the first kind, and therefore with both more convincing phenomenology and a complex and hence more informative view of personal identity. Thank you.
For discussion, yes, we have Lynne. The microphone, yes.
Right.
To Lynne.
How's this? It's okay? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. It's hard to know where to start because, in fact, I reject all the fishing cases, period, flat. And I wrote an article in Journal of Philosophy that was published in March 2013, in which I rejected the principle that's based on fishing cases and certainly reject profit. I think those cases are not only absurd, but also if they raise the problem, very problem you charge me with is not going to be any fact of the matter about who's the person in those middle cases. And that's, of course, what Parker is saying. What matters in survival is not identity, not personal identity at all. It's continuity, physical and psychological continuity. So I reject that just absolutely, totally. In fact, I would never even consider talking about it. So I did talk about what I do think, and that is my not so simple view. I give the alternatives that are logically exhaustive. And I say, we don't know which one is the case. Well, we're doing ontology, we're not doing epistemology. So it doesn't matter if you don't know which one is the case, if you know all the possibilities. Let's go to fission products, like Merkel's first-person perspective. You think that phenomenologically, two fission products of Merkel would be phenomenologically indistinguishable. I don't doubt that at all. But they wouldn't both have Merkel's memories. They would both apparently have Merkel's memories. One wouldn't really have the memory, or neither would have the memories. They would just apparently have Merkel's memories. Secondly, you can't, the idea of replacing Merkel's molecules one by one with Putin's, not only I think is absurd, I don't think a first-person perspective is qualitative at all. I think it's a formal capacity, like a capacity to think of yourself, conceive of yourself as yourself from the first person. So nothing qualitative is going to be even relevant to a first-person perspective, and is not going to, a first-person perspective will not supervene on your molecules. I don't want to reduce persons to modes of consciousness. That's true. And I don't think I did talk about that, but I don't see why I should, because there's somebody like Strawson, Jalen Strawson, believes that we used to have the punctate. There are punctate states. We're just punctate persons. And I do not believe that. Also, I reject classical mereology. I've been arguing on that. But in any case, I just don't find any of the difference.
Okay. Sorry.
See what happens.
I'm aware that you mention at different occasions in your books that you have, I think you put it this way, little patience with thought experiments like this. I take this to be some kind of half-heartedly comment, because I'm not sure if it means I presuppose that these thought experiments, that they can't learn anything from these thought experiments, but because you sometimes discuss these thought experiments, as one or two of the quotes I had in my talk from your book. I think you wouldn't go so far to say that someone who does not rule out these thought experiments from the outset cannot learn anything from your book. As far as I understand you want to say, okay, my theory of first-person perspectives is such that even someone can adopt it that does not reject all these thought experiments from the outset. So is it a presupposition of yours that these thought experiments are ill-conceived or too far away from reality, or does your theory not rest on this claim?
I don't think my view rests on that claim. However, I do think I think part of this is absolutely, I don't understand why people are so taken with Parfit myself, but that is not what my view does not rest on that. My view rests on the indivisibility and the definiteness of a robust first-person perspective, or any kind of first-person perspective. Once you get it, it's gradual coming into existence. But once you have it, you exist as long as you are that exemplifier of the first person perspective. Now that does make my not so simple view, my not so simple view circular. But I defend that in my J. Phil article.
You mentioned something else, namely that there's a difference between the two fission products, lefty and righty, that one has true memories of being Angela Merkel and the other one...
No, but we don't know. At most, one has true memories.
Yeah.
Maybe neither has true memories.
At most one.
In fact, I suspect that Angela Merkel goes out of existence when she fissions.
Yeah.
So I'm not rejecting fission art. I mean, that's just sort of a personal remark about what I think about fission arguments. But it's not. It doesn't. Nothing in my view depends on a priori. Rejecting fission arguments, but if their fission were to exist, if that were possible, then my guess is that Angela Merkel goes out of existence when the fission happens, rather than that she is now two people. That makes no sense. That is absurd.
Okay, I think that this may come down to rejecting the fission case altogether, because one presupposition of this case is that it is perfectly symmetrical, and that there is nothing in lefty that there is not in righty, or vice versa.
That's true. There's nothing left in lefty, in molecule for molecule, that's not in righty, molecule for molecule. But I'm saying I don't think the first person perspective supervenes on molecules at all. Mm-hmm. So I'm not, and also you can't split a first person perspective, because a first-person perspective is not qualitative. If it were qualitative, if I were David Lewis and thought that everything was qualitative, then I'd have to admit that you could have two qualitatively identical things, and the qualitative properties are the only properties there are. Then you'd really have fission problems. But as long as the first-person perspective is not qualitative to start with, you're not going to get two fission products who both have the same beginning first-person perspective, the same original first-person perspective.
We have to stop here and thanks Marc, because we still have the next talk with our invited speaker. So thanks, Marc.